Hello everybody, my name is Jack, and I'm going to tell the story of Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, a poor woodcutter lived with his two children, Hansel and Gretel, beside a large forest. The children's mother had died, but after a time the woodcutter married again. They never had much to eat in the house, but then came a famine and there wasn't even enough bread for the four of them. One night, the woodcutter lay in bed, tossing and turning with worry. Finally, he sighed and said to his wife, "What will happen to us? How can we feed my poor children when we barely have enough for ourselves?" The wife answered, "Listen to me. Tomorrow we'll take kids deep into the forest and give them each a piece of bread. Then we'll leave them there. They'll never find their way home. And then we won't have to feed them anymore." "No, my love," said the man. "I don't want to do it. I won't do it. How could I leave my children alone in the woods? We'd never see them again." "You fool," she said. "There are four of us. We'll starve if we don't do it." And she gave him no peace until he finally agreed. The children were too hungry to sleep that night, though, so they had overheard their stepmother talking. Gretel began to cry and said, "Oh, Hansel, there's no hope for us. What'll we do?" "Don't worry, Gretel," said Hansel. "We'll find a way. I'll find a way." When the grown-ups were asleep, he got up and put on his jacket and crept outside. The moon was shining bright, and the pebbles on the ground glittered like silver coins. Hansel stuffed his pockets full of them. At daybreak, the stepmother came and woke the children. "Get up, you lazy, selfish children. We're going to the forest to collect wood." She then handed them each a piece of bread and said, "This is for your lunch. Don't eat it too soon, or there won't be any more." Gretel put the bread in her apron, both of them, because Hansel had his pockets full of pebbles. Then all four of them set out for the forest. But Hansel kept stopping and looking back. Each time he turned, he took a shiny pebble from his pocket and dropped it onto the ground. When they came to the middle of the forest, their father said, "Start gathering wood here, children, and I'll make a fire to keep you warm." Hansel and Gretel gathered twigs till they had a good pile. The fire was lit, and when the flames were high enough, the stepmother said, "Now, children, lie down here and rest. We're going into the forest to cut down some more wood. When we're done, we'll come back and get you." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and at midday they had ate their pieces of bread. They heard strokes of the axe and thought their father was nearby. But it wasn't an axe. It was a branch he had tied to a dead tree, so that it would sound like chopping when the wind blew it to and fro. After some time, they were so tired that their eyes closed and they fell asleep. And when at last they woke, night had fallen. Gretel began to cry and said, "How will we ever get out of this forest, Hansel?" But Hansel comforted her. "Just wait a little while. As soon as the moon rises, we'll find our way home." And when the full moon has risen, indeed, Hansel took his little sister by the hand and they followed the pebbles, now glistening like silver pieces, which showed their way home. They walked all night and eventually reached their father's house as day was breaking. When the stepmother opened the door and saw them, she cried, "Wicked children! Why did you stay so long in the forest?" But the father was overjoyed, for he had been very unhappy since he had had to leave them. Time passed and the famine continued. The children heard their stepmother talking to the father in bed. "Everything has been eaten. We have only half a loaf of bread left. The children must go. We'll take them even deeper into the forest, and this time they won't find their way home. It's our only hope." The father was heavy-hearted. He thought it would be better to share his last bite with his children, but the stepmother wouldn't listen and only scolded and insulted him. and once you've said yes, it's hard to say no, and so the woodcutter gave in again. Once again the children were awake and heard the conversation. When the grown-ups were asleep, Hansel got up again. He wanted to gather more pebbles, but the stepmother had locked the door so he couldn't get out. Still, he comforted his little sister, saying, "Don't cry, Gretel. God will help us." Early in the morning, the stepmother came and got the children out of bed. She gave them their pieces of bread, but this time smaller than before. On the way through the forest, Hansel kept turning back and dropping a few breadcrumbs on the ground. The stepmother led the children to a place deep in the forest, where they had never seen before. Again they made a fire, and she said, "Just sit here, children. If you get tired, you can sleep. We're going to cut wood, and this evening, when we've finished, we'll come and get you." At midday, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, as he had scattered his on the ground to make the trail. They fell asleep, and the afternoon passed, but no one came for the poor children. It was dark when they woke, and Hansel comforted his little sister. "Gretel," he said, "just wait till the moon rises, then we'll see the breadcrumbs scattered, and they'll show us the way home." And indeed, the moon rose, and they set out, but they didn't find any breadcrumbs, because this time birds of the forest had eaten them all up. Hansel said to Gretel, "Don't worry, we'll still find a way." But they didn't find it. They walked all night, and then all day, from morning to night, and they were very hungry. They had eaten only a few berries they picked from the bushes. When they were so tired their legs could carry them no further, they lay down under a tree and fell asleep. Now it was the third morning since they had left their father's house. They started out again, but wandered even deeper and deeper to the forest, and unless help came soon, they would surely die of hunger and weariness. At midday they saw a lovely snowbird sitting on a branch, singing so beautifully that they stood still and listened. Then it flapped his wings and flew on ahead, and they followed until the bird came to a little house and perched on the roof. Coming closer, they saw that the house wasn't made of stone or wood, but was made of gingerbread, and the roof was made of cake and windows of sparkling sugar. "We're saved, let's eat some," said Hansel. "I'll take a piece of the roof. You try and take some of the window, it looks sweet." Hansel reached up and broke a bit of the roof to see how it tasted, and Gretel pressed against the window panes and nibbled at them. Then a soft voice called from inside, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's that nibbling at my house?" The children answered, "It's only the wind so wild," and they carried on eating. Hansel liked the taste of the roof, so he broke off a big chunk, and Gretel took out a whole window pane and sat down on the ground to enjoy it. All at once the door opened, and an old woman came hobbling out. Hansel and Gretel were so frightened they dropped what they were eating. But the old woman nodded her head and said, "Oh, what dear children! However did you get here? Don't be afraid. Come in and stay with me." She took them by the hand and led them into her house. A fine meal of milk and pancakes, sugar and apple and nuts were set before them. Then 2 little beds were made up, clean and white, and Hansel and Gretel got into them and thought they were in heaven. But the old woman was only pretending to be kind. She was really a wicked witch who tempted children into her house, where she killed, cooked, and ate them up. She had built her house out of gingerbread just to entice them. Witches have red eyes and couldn't see very far, but they had a keen sense of smell and know when humans are coming close. Early the next morning the witch got up, and when she saw the children sleeping, she muttered to herself, "What tasty morsels they will be." She grabbed Hansel by a scrawny hand and carried him up to a little shed and bolted the door. He screamed so loud as he could, but no one, not even his sister, could hear him. Then the witch went back to Gretel and shook her awake and cried, "Get up, lazy, selfish child. You must fetch water and cook something for your brother. He's locked in the shed, and we will fatten him up. When he's nice and plump, I shall eat him." Gretel wept bitterly and cried all day, but she had to do what the wicked witch told her. Every morning the witch went to the shed and said, "Hansel, hold out your finger. Let's feel how fat you've gotten." But Hansel held out a bone instead. Because she couldn't see very well, she thought it was his finger, and she was confused why he was staying so thin. After 4 weeks had gone by, the boy was skinny as ever. She decided she couldn't wait any longer. "Gretel," the witch cried out, "fetch water and don't dawdle. Skinny or fat, I'm going to cook Hansel up tomorrow." The little girl wailed and tears flowed down her cheeks. "Dear God," she cried, "won't you help us?" "Stop that blubbering," said the witch. "It won't do you any bit of good." Early in the morning, Hansel had to fill the kettle with water and light the fire. "First we'll do some baking," said the old witch. "I've heated the oven and kneaded the dough." And she took poor Gretel out to the oven, which by now was spitting fire. "Crawl in," said the little witch, "and see if it's hot enough for bread." But the witch was getting close to close the door on Gretel and roast her so he could eat her too. But for all her crying, Gretel was clever, and she guessed what the witch must be thinking and said, But I don't know how to get in." "Silly goose," said the witch. "The door is big enough. Look, even I can get in." She crept to the oven and stuck her head in. In that moment Gretel gave her a great push and closed the iron door and fastened the bolt. How horribly the witch shrieked as she died. Gretel ran straight to Hansel and opened the door of the shed and cried, "Hansel, we're saved! The witch is dead!" Hansel hopped out like a bird freed from his cage. Now how happy they were! They hugged and kissed each other and danced around, and now there was nothing to be afraid of. They went into the witch's house, and in every corner they found boxes of pearls and precious stones. Hansel stuffed his pockets full of them, saying, "These will be much better than pebbles." Gretel too filled her apron with them. "We'd better leave now," said Hansel, "and get out of this wicked forest." They walked a long way and came to a body of water. "How will we get across?" said Hansel. "There's no bridge." "And no boat either," said Gretel. "But over there I see a white duck. She'll help us." She cried out, "Duckling, please give us a ride." Sure enough, the duck came to them and took them across one at a time. When they were safely over and had walked on some way, the forest looked more and more familiar, and finally they saw their home in the distance. They began to run. They flew into the house and threw themselves into their father's arms. The poor man hadn't been happy since he had had to leave his children in the forest, and in the meantime his wife had died. He was so happy not to be alone anymore. Gretel opened up her little apron, and the pearls and precious stones went bouncing around the room. Hansel reached into his pockets and tossed out handful after handful. Now their worries were over. The famine was gone, and they lived happily ever after. The end.